let's hone in on one of those headline stories now. Overpriced PPE, mismanaged funds and rampant looting. These were just some of the revelations that were contained in the Auditor-General's real-time audit of the COVID-19 Relief Fund. Since the start of the lockdown, government has set aside about 147 billion rand for 16 COVID-19 relief initiatives, but the Auditor-General has found that the speedy implementation of some of the initiatives led to mistakes being made and opportunities were created for abuse. For more on this report, let's bring in the Auditor-General himself, Kimi Makwetu, joining us now via our telephone line. Dr. Makwetu, thanks very much for making time for the AM report. Let me start by gauging your sentiments when the President finally announced that 500 billion rand COVID-19 relief fund. Knowing the inefficiencies that exist within our system, were you at all surprised by what you found?
Ayanda, I didn't get the last part, sorry.
I'm just asking, knowing what you knew about our shortcomings within the system, were you surprised about the outcomes of your audit?
Well, let me assume that I understand what you said, but what happened at the beginning was that we often know that when there are emergency processes that are triggered in an environment where the controls are known to be weak, they often require additional steps to be taken in order to make sure that those monies are protected as best as the system can do. Yeah. So in this instance, what our first reaction was to reach out to the accounting officers to sensitize them to the need for them to put more preventative controls in their environments. And that was the first step.
Right. All right. So this step you're saying you communicated before undertaking the audit. So as far as you know, some of the officials at the forefront of dispersing some of these funds should have known where the cracks are.
Absolutely, because remember the annual reports as well as the annual audits that we do often hammer on exactly the same issues. The issues of weaknesses in supply chain, the weaknesses of financial management, where, for example, accounting records are not often kept accurately and such like. So our initial step then was to say that the best medicine, if you are going to be confronted by emergencies with lesser staff available during the lockdown, the best thing is probably to look at how best can you increase the level of rigor in terms of preventative controls. And we knew that a month or two later, when we come back to do detection work, we're going to rely on whether or not they were responsive to our initial counsel. Unfortunately, our detection tests revealed that nothing much was done to enhance the level of preventative controls, hence the litany of findings.
So to drive this point home, and this is a question I also wanted to ask explicitly, to what extent were the efficiencies on issues that you had raised previously in the past? In other words, how many of the red flags were actually nothing new?
It's difficult to put a number in terms of the quantity, but I think if you look at the substantive elements as well as the quality issues, many South Africans, I think, are sensitized to this issue. And if you look back maybe the last 2 to 3 years, many have even become numb to the repetitiveness of these issues as they were contained in our regular annual audits. So clearly it's nothing new, but I think now it got elevated because of the many pressures that are confronting all of us as a consequence of the COVID-19. So it's almost like a case of, if I can put it differently, we have always highlighted the frightening possibility of something going wrong, but I think now we are confronting the horrendous reality of it having gone wrong.
Quite a chilling sentiment, really. And in spite of this dismal picture that was painted, the audit teams, as we're told in the report, actually weren't even able to get all the required information from the relevant stakeholders. To what extent did this have a bearing on, I guess, the outcomes that you were able to give at the end of the day? I guess at the back of our minds, this actually could be way worse.
Well, Ayanda, in this context, I think we all had to contend with the same conditions. Remember, our own staff are also vulnerable to the impact of the virus, so they were not able to move around as freely. But at the same time, also our auditees were facing similar challenges. So from time to time, they had to close shop and disinfect their environments, and we had to stay away. And we were also aware that there were lesser of them than what we used to work with before. So I think on that part, we're not really going to attach any fault to anybody. It was really just the conditionality of the time. If you look back to the period June, July, and so on. But under normal circumstances, we had been delayed, but we are not complaining. We do understand that it was both sides, and nobody would have escaped or got careless, if you like, and exposed people to this virus. Because initially, our view was that we will do everything to protect our staff from having been infected, but we will try and do the work as best we can. So I really think that was not too much of a big issue, but it was something to work. However, we didn't stop, because we've got a second report that we've committed to, which will be building up to those areas where we are able to catch up now in August as well as in September. And hopefully before the end of November, we'll be able to come up with a follow-up report.
Right, so you can't unequivocally state that some officials were deliberately withholding crucial information. That's what you're saying?
It would be unfair, really, to take it that far, because remember, the COVID-19 was a lockdown period. Right. Our own staff were restricted in terms of their own mobility, and the same happened with our auditees. I mean, to be fair, you could almost be suspicious and say that's probably what was behind it, but I think it will be too much to put a finger to it.
So nonetheless, we did see overspending, other spending in some cases, but I want to hone in on one of the outcomes from that report, and that's the risk that the 350 Rand COVID-19 relief grant being paid to people who are actually not in distress. Are you able to help us better understand the extent of that risk? How far spread do you rate this is?
Well, I mean, there are many elements of it, and we have flagged the extracts, and we have identified the specific cases in that regard. But let's take an example of this, Ayanda. Maybe it'll dawn on many people that this is indeed possible if you don't put in place preventative controls. If you take, for example, a 19-year-old who is in a tertiary institution, privately funded by their parents, which means that that person doesn't appear on the UIF database because they are not employed, or they do not appear on the SARS database or any one of the other databases, including NSFAS. So if that person forwards their ID number to SASSA based on one of the channels of claiming this 350, in terms of their qualification criteria, that 19-year-old will qualify for the 350 and will get paid the 350 for 6 months. No one will be able to detect it because it's one of the issues that are weaknesses in terms of the qualifying criteria, where you pay a 350 monthly to somebody who technically is not in distress. I say so because this person is a student, is being paid for from home, and has the ability to submit a claim in regards to a 350 payment. From that to somebody who might have access to other people's ID numbers, whether they are in incarceration or wherever. Some of those examples have popped up in our tests. And so you are actually vulnerable now because you've invited people and they can come in thousands if you're not careful, or millions, and you would be paying them without knowing, because why? You didn't stand back and say, what other preventative controls do I have to think about? Because there's the possibility of attracting, when you throw the net into the water, attracting crabs instead of fish only is always there.
It's a good point. Let's stay with the analogy you made about the 19-year-old. Do you have an example of an interventive measure that could have prevented somebody in that position from unduly benefiting from this COVID-19?
Well, if you responded to the preventative control, you could then say, in the database, we're going to look for this category of ID numbers. And if we identify this category of ID numbers, let's say, for example, we are targeting that category of people. Let's take an example of all ID numbers for 19-year-olds to 28-year-olds. And if you pick them up and they are in large numbers, you can then set up a section in your department at SASSA made up of 2 or 3 people and ask them to get in touch with those particular persons, because they would have ordered their phone numbers as well, isn't it? Because they want to be phoned in order for them to get confirmation as to whether they are getting the benefit or not. And just check them, because you can do all sorts of things to check them. If I was in that position, I would say, hey, hello, so-and-so, how are you? How are things at varsity? Type of stuff, Because those are some of the measures that you can use, because you are now testing completeness of a database as well as the validity of the database. So there's a multitude of tactics that you can use to actually detect whether indeed you do have those people in large numbers.
Right.
So preventative controls are not prescriptive. They are about how creative you can be if you understand the nature of the risk and how to respond to it.
Sure. Of course, the big question on many South Africans' minds this morning will be, how possible is it really to recover some of the money that's been unduly paid to people who don't need it, or probably passed on due to corruption? I mean, you've been at the forefront of looking at how the system works. Are you confident that the money can be recouped?
It can be. It can be. Our decision to pass on these things to the multi-agency fusion center is exactly to try and do that. Unlike audits that we've done over the years, where we are on the cold phase 16 months after the event, now we are reporting exactly a month after the July payments, which means that there are other payments that are still going to be made. So if you have taken our recommendations specifically and directly, you can stop at a minimum further payments from being made.
Right.
But at the same time, if somebody has, for example, if you look at the PPE procurement, if somebody has been paid 2 million rand and there are all sorts of problems with that, let's hope that that person has not completely spent that money. So what can you do? You can invoke the powers of the SIU for a preservation order, as they have done with some of these other payments, because the beauty about this is that if you do it quickly and you report on it quickly, there is still a possibility that you can stop some of that money from being used, because it is unlikely that someone who possibly has been paid 20 million could have spent all of it by now. So there's a greater chance that it can.
Yeah, I guess we live in hope. Speaking of which, this report certainly had a litany of things that went wrong, but I'm interested in the prospect of any silver lining whatsoever. Is there any good news that can come of what you found?
Preventative controls, I think, for us are the key area that a lot of our government agencies ought to look at. Because if you think about this, there's a recurring pattern of government commitments in respect of monies that ought to be paid in respect of various programs. And if you do not orientate the system towards embracing information technology controls, where government department information at Home Affairs can be available to other agencies so that they can do the routine integrity checks on their databases, but at the same time elevate the role of accounting officers in making sure that their environments are protected from a preventative controls point of view. So for us, I think we can build a high wall around the systems in government over a period of time, because currently the barriers to entry, unfortunately, are very low in a number of areas. And to chase after things that have gone wrong in an environment where the barriers are low is very expensive and costly.
Absolutely.
So I do think that indeed if government reacts to this and realize that for what it's worth, there's a lot that can be saved and a lot that can be fixed if proactive steps are taken. We do believe that this audit provides a lead in seeing how best proactive measures can be put to good use.
Absolutely. A point already well made. Kimi Makwetu is the Auditor-General of South Africa. Mr. Makwetu, thanks very much indeed for your time.